Okay, good afternoon. This is Bill Bushka again. Wanting to talk about the direction I'm heading with an opportunity that's come up to possibly do some more professional interviews. I won't be specific, but I will start today with one topic as to where my thoughts are headed. I'm going to switch over to this Word document. I want to talk about the problem of equality versus equity on essentially a societal or political level. And then in another video, I'll talk about how this would affect me personally. Now, equality refers to the idea that every individual should have the same opportunities for personal advancement. And this might be affected by both family circumstances and individual heredity. Whereas equity refers to trying to have equal outcomes, which is impossible in an individual level because people are born with differences. For example, I could never, no matter how favorable my background, I could never hit a baseball pitched at 100 miles per hour, for example. So I can't make hundreds of millions of dollars with a baseball contract. I mean, it's an extreme example. Social justice advocates are particularly concerned about categories of race. It looks like I need to fix that right now. This is a work in progress. Anyway, are concerned about aggregate results by race and other categories. In open societies like liberal societies, what we call liberal, inequities can be severe enough to cause instability and eventually lead to conflict. We call it civil war, breakdown, and possibly, coups and a total breakdown and catastrophe for many people. At an individual level, differences in inherited ability may be more important than we want to admit because of where they can lead if there's no control. So in a sense, we're talking about ableism as well, more than I think racism, for example. And so what are the solutions as a matter of principle? Well, generally you make a society more closed, and the basic idea that you start with is that a group takes care of its own people and takes care of its own people who are less gifted than others are. Now, when you have what I would call a natural grouping of people is typically an ethnicity, which might be extended families up to a tribe, and it might also be identified with a particular religion. And typically, the defining characteristic of it is it is capable of forming a country or an autonomous political unit. And that's one reason why ethno-states appeal to some people, particularly on the right, and why it's disturbing an idea as it is, and it sounds like, white supremacy in our own society. But at a certain level, the idea makes sense. The idea, it does encourage tribalism in which in the extended families and tribes take care of their own people. There was a book called The Natural Family back in about 2007 by Carlson and Merrow that talked a lot about this. Typically, a tribal society may want to exclude outsiders and immigrants because it may see them as an economic burden. Of course, it could try to exploit them as a source of labor. It could see them as a threat to public health. And it may expect all people to contribute to raising children and caring for the elderly, filial responsibility, including people who are not able to have their own children. It might regard LGBTQ persons as freeloaders on everyone else who actually have children and have the responsibility for them. That was a view that used to be common more in the past. Many groups will believe they are better off than other peoples, and in a world where there's a zero-sum game, you can see rationalization for having the right to conquer and obliterate other peoples. Well, that's what's going on right now with Russia attacking Ukraine, for example. There are many examples in history. I would coin a term for it. I would call it Putlerism now. With open societies, an open society usually assumes that the individual is the major driver of personal identity. So an open society may encourage marginalized people to form their own groups, and they may combine into intersectionalities, which is, of course, is the idea on the left right now. Now, these might be labor unions or groups identified by social function, such as the LGBTQIA. It might comprise different subcategories that are at odds with each other. For example, I think cisgender gay men are probably at some distance from the trans and non-binary community, especially the part of it that is trying to bring it into the school systems. There's a problem when individuals are encouraged to surrender their personal agency and derive their sense of personal identity from an invented group and these are invented groups when you call gay people a group, or you call even people with disabilities a group. They're not the same thing, don't misunderstand me, but it's not the same thing as a group that is defined by ethnicity and biological heredity. It's something that's manufactured. So this reduces openness and makes society tend to return to tribalism, but in a manner that probably would tend towards communism. Marxist theory when you apply it to marginalized groups. One of the things I would mention is that another example of a group in this setting is a labor union, which is has nothing directly to do with sexuality, but it is an interest group. One of the important features of these groups is that they pressure people who may benefit from their solidarity and their activism to become members rather than do things on their own and lowball the other people in the group. That's a very important problem in practice. An extreme example would be, for example, if you could not have your own presence online today unless you actively joined an anti-racist initiative, because the problem, particularly as in critical race theory, was seen as so critical in hurting people of color that everyone had to participate in doing something about remedying it at the group level. It isn't quite that bad, but there are people who've called for that. The idea that silence is violence, the idea that people have gone into restaurants and tried to recruit outdoor dining and tried to recruit people to join them and create a lot of disruption. So this is something that is really problematic. So if you want to speak publicly and have a reputation, you may find a lot of pressure to work with established organizations rather than simply do things yourself. And that's particularly true if you don't make a living from speaking yourself, as I don't. Since I'm retired, I do have some resources. And so you might be seen as lowballing people who do make a living from it or who do need to depend on others more than you do. That's another good question that would go along with that would be who is entitled to who can call themselves a journalist. I certainly am a commentator on things, but I can't really legitimately call myself a member of the press, for example, would be a side product of this. So that's what I have to say for today, and soon I will talk more about how this affects me personally. I will be working on polishing my own video style and getting some more equipment and getting better set up. But I do these videos very quickly right now. So that's where I am today. Thanks.